I think we'll get started. This is, as I assume you all know, this is the CSIS Careers and Development Series. And with me today is Marcia Wong, who, I've known you a long time. I didn't realize you did just about everything under the sun, if you read the bio. She's now the policy advisor for the International Committee of the Red Cross, but she's had all kinds of jobs in the exec sec at State Department, working for Colin Powell and, was it Condoleezza Rice? And she was the associate dean or the assistant dean at the Foreign Service Institute. She's worked for George Shultz.
Now you're dating me.
Yeah, well, true, but she did.
I was 12.
And she helped set up a number of new offices and bureaus and aid in state. It has an incredible background and experience in the State Department and USAID, and now with the international organization, the International Committee of Red Cross, which a lot of people don't know a great deal about. And that organization plays an incredibly important role, not just, we think of it nowadays more in terms of humanitarian assistance, but tracing prisoner visits, hostage situations. ICRC plays an incredibly broad role, often behind the scenes, in what's going on in international relations. So you've had an interesting whole bunch of places to work. So I will turn it over to you.
I can't keep a job, though?
That's another way of putting it, but I won't say that. So please, Marcia, over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Bill and CSIS for hosting me today, and I appreciate everyone's attendance. But first of all, I want to say Happy Halloween, because I think it's one of the, Happy Halloween.
No costume.
No costume. Well, maybe. I could be masquerading as a professional, but I'll let you decide that after this conversation. But I do know this is a very professional crowd, because I don't see a pirate or a Jedi Knight among any of you. So we'll try to keep it at a high-level conversation. When talking to Bill a little bit about what would be of interest today, as he mentioned, he said if I could start off a little bit with the International Committee of the Red Cross. So if you would indulge me a few minutes on that, and there was some information out in the front for you to help yourselves. Because my origins actually are very much, and I'm self-described as a chronic public servant. I've worked for many years with the U.S. government, with State Department and USAID. But I have found myself now at a Swiss-based private organization. It's an international organization that's over 150 years old, and importantly, it is not the American Red Cross. That's the first thing I need to impress on you, because when I do say, oh, I've joined, ICRC, people will answer, it's a beautiful building on East Street with a big Red Cross. I'm like, it is a beautiful building, but it's not ours. So let me give you just a little bit of the ICRC, and if you can indulge me a little bit. It is founded in 1863, and it's very much based in international humanitarian law. You're familiar with the Geneva Conventions, and the ICRC's kind of pillars is indeed conflict and working in conflict. So if I can actually take you down a little bit of what it is not, it's not a non-governmental organization. We're often sort of seen in the same prism of NGO work, but the principles of the ICRC are based on neutrality, impartiality, and independence. And that allows us to perhaps maybe go where some other NGOs are not allowed to go because of that. We're not a development organization. We're not DFID. We're not USAID. Although as I go into a little bit of the story of where I think ICRC may be heading, you'll see some very interesting dimensions of development-like work. We're not a human rights organization. We do believe in dignity and respect for people's livelihoods for protection, as Bill mentioned, in both detention and for victims of armed conflict. But we don't necessarily have the transformational agenda that a human rights organization may have in terms of good governance. What are the many other things we're not? We're certainly not the U.S. government. And so I was an interesting hire for the ICRC, given my long history with State Department and EID. But the reason they hired me to be a policy advisor here in the Washington office was because of my background. If I can go in a little bit of just sort of the three kind of big main areas where ICRC work. Prevention is a very big part of it, and that is based very much into international humanitarian law. And if I can ask that question, and I don't want you to be singled out and then have things thrown at you, are there lawyers in the room? Okay, good, we can talk about them now. International humanitarian law, I mean, you think of the Geneva Conventions, you think of a whole body of work based in both treaty and what they call customary law. I am not a lawyer, so I am not going to go deep into this. Plenty of information on the website, and certainly I can offer up the lawyers that we have in our office if you or your organization is interested in understanding IHL more. But what IHL does, and this is something actually very important to think of when you think of the ICRC, we're not conflict prevention and we're not peace builders. We understand conflict takes place. We hope through our prevention work that people will think twice about going down into the world of conflict, but conflict happens, war happens, non-international armed conflict, that's a legal categorization, that happens. So what ICRC does is, what is the conduct that armed forces should have, or non-state armed groups should have in conflict? What is their posture and treatment towards civilians? And so if you understand that conflict might be a given, then how do we behave in conflict? You probably feel a little bit, maybe like all of us do at times, a little cynical about IHL and does it really work anymore? You know, where's the respect and where's the compliance? And if you saw some of the literature I put out today, there was one booklet I put out there called Healthcare in Danger. And if there's any one example that really brings it home to you about why IHL, why war has limits, is when some military forces or non-state armed groups think it's okay to, bomb a schoolhouse or attack a hospital. So you'll see today, we actually launched it. There's a video on YouTube. ICRC has produced another reminder about that war does have limits and war has rules. And so in terms of our prevention work, we have our armed forces delegates, former military from different armed forces, training with different military forces. We certainly are very, very engaged with the U.S. military on the importance of IHL. And we hope through the U.S. military, as they train others, as we know, our military colleagues, some of you have even been involved in probably some of these lectures and training, African peacekeepers working in Nigeria, is the U.S. military also imparting the importance of IHL and protection of civilians to their partners in this. One would hope that through these prevention conversations that you have at both national level and subnational and local level, that people will think twice about women and children. They're non-combatants. This is how we need to treat them. This is how we need to protect them. So there is a whole prevention arm, but it's not conflict prevention, as I think many of you may or may not be engaged in. It's not peace building in that way. Then when we go into protection, as Bill mentioned, there's both a protection element of those who are combatants, who are no longer combatants. And one of the way to describe it might be a field arm of what Washington Delegation Office does here is the work on Guantanamo. As you can imagine, there were certain, what would you call it, sort of an inflection point in over the last 15 years where the U.S. was engaged, or is engaged, into military interventions, and Guantanamo became a real centerpiece of our relationship back in the early 2000s. We are still visiting Guantanamo 4 times a year. We're still visiting the prisoners who are held prisoners. That's also a categorization. I can't quite remember what I should be referring to them as, enemy prisoners. And we work very, very closely with DOD and with State Department and others on their welfare, on their rights to family links, for lack of a better way to describe it, on the rights to be able to talk to their family. And if they indeed get transferred, that where they are transferred to, that there is protections accorded to them. So that's a very specific sort of protection angle to what we do here in Washington. But we're also getting very much involved in the migration movements coming up from Central America. Many of you have been watching the spike in activity of unaccompanied children, vulnerable women and other families coming in across the border. So we're now finding ourselves more and more engaged in that in a sort of geographic sense, but we're also very engaged in the global displacement issues. So protection can be really looked at under a very large umbrella of both work and detention, and we do have sort of an all-detainee policy. So if we're working in the prisons of Manila, it may be working with prisoners who may have been put there because of conflict in Mindanao, but they also might have been somebody who got swept up in a drug raid. But we're trying to ensure that there's rights and protections for them. But protection largely also is about sexual violence, preventing sexual violence. It's about making sure that people have access even in urban violence settings, which is not armed conflict in sort of a traditional sense of military or organized rebel groups, but criminality. You know, how are women and children getting access to health services? How are they getting access to their schools? So even criminality, we're beginning to explore the impact of urban violence and the reverberation effects that it has on civilian populations. And then maybe for this audience, because the title is Careers and Development, assistance. I mentioned that ICRC is not a development agency, but it is a place that has worked, and this actually surprises a lot of people, because perhaps in your mind, when you think of the ICRC, you think of ambulances racing down, you know, streets, or buildings are collapsing and fires coming out of the windows. But the ICRC, and please look it up on the website, has just released a study on protracted conflict and humanitarian response. And its average presence in some of these places, and you can tick them off, you know, Gaza, Iraq, South Sudan, is 36 years. And so what does that say about protracted conflict? Is that it doesn't ever really end, and that you have these constant cycles of violence. And for the ICRC, the exit strategy is a hard one. And we're in some of these communities for decades working on maintaining their water infrastructure, because right now the local authorities or national authorities don't have the means or capability or resources to do that. We're still working on health delivery systems, sanitation. So we are finding ourselves in that development conversation now of, if we're in these places for 30 years and we're maintaining both the intellectual capital, keep a water infrastructure going, we're maintaining, you know, resources coming in, we're actually turning the water on in Aleppo or in northern Lebanon, how can we bring the conversation to the development actors? When is it stable enough that we can start having those transition conversations? And that is something that I think a lot of you have heard a lot. I know, you know, some of our colleagues here have worked very, very deliberately on the humanitarian and development sectors. And when do you start creating, this is Marcia's word, this is not, I don't think, development lexicon, Bill can kick me under the table, some sort of blended approach, because I think we recognize humanitarian may never really ever stop, but development can probably start earlier and not wait for some flare to go up. So even though ICRC is not a development agency, we certainly are in a process and a system of what we call preserving development holds and making sure that there are no development reversals. So I'll stop there. About the ICRC, if that's all right. And if there's questions on that, I'm happy to take them, or I can talk a little bit about State Department and AID experiences too.
I got a whole bunch of questions on that, but why don't you talk a little bit about State Department and AID?
Okay. Bill just outed me that I work for Secretary Schultz. Okay, that was a long time ago. Many of you might not even remember who he is, but he was a very well-loved and very popular Secretary Schultz. Long time ago. Foreign Service did it the old-fashioned way, which, you know, many of you have taken, and I'm happy to talk to any of you who've taken the Foreign Service exam or considering it, because even though I work for a neutral, independent, impartial organization, my roots were in the U.S. government and in the Foreign Service. I'm still a very big fan of public service in the United States, so if you find yourself in that lucky position, please do consider it. But unlike, I think, a lot of the candidates today, I came in quite young, 12. I came right in after undergraduate, which I think is a little bit of it's not an aberration now. I think that they certainly can recruit people with the hard languages. So if anybody here speaks Farsi, Chinese, Urdu, Hindu, put your hand up. We'll talk after this. There you go. So the State Department was an extraordinary, you know, career for me. But I think when I bumped into the whole development world, I think the first time, and I really am dating myself, but as we think about what is going to shape your careers, what is shaping your career today, you know, was there an inflection point for you? And I think over the course of maybe Bill and my combined too many years, there's probably different, you know, tipping points of where you take different career paths. You can be very linear in your career path, or you can, you know, work it like a soccer field and zigzag. Some of us zigzag. So I'm going to date myself, but this was a time when I think you probably saw an attempt for the whole of government response, but I don't think we called it that, was the collapse of the former Soviet Union. Mm-hmm. Boom. You know, it was like, I think AID, that was doing great work everywhere, was like, wait, now we've got this former, you know, behemoth that was all about, you know, against the capitalist system. It was a communist system, and now we have opportunity to bring free markets, transparency, democracy, and all those wonderful nouns that you wanted to bring to society that was reforming. And so I was on, I can think back on the year and a half I was on it. It started off as the Soviet Union desk. It became the former Soviet Union desk, and then it became the Independent States and Commonwealth Affairs desk. I didn't speak Russian, but it was a time of the government, this government, U.S. government said, this is a tipping point for us to bring in these republics into free markets, into some sort of democratic order. So a lot of resources started flowing very fast towards this. And that was probably my first exposure to sort of the bigger world of development. I was on at that time then, the Independent States and Commonwealth Affairs desk, and they asked people, we need to start sending out small teams out to these republics to start talking to what was going to be there as foreign ministries, to start thinking about putting up the flag for the United States. And once we get our flag up, and once we have diplomatic relations with Belarus and Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan, and a lot of us, to be honest, were trying to spell Kyrgyzstan for the longest time. I'm sorry, is anybody here from the embassy? But it was like Y's and Z's and S's. I mean, it was really unplowed ground for a lot of people. So teams coming out of our embassy in Moscow and people from the desk, we all kind of put up our hand and became rovers, basically. And we were kind of running through the circuit of the Caucasus and Central Asia and Belarus and Moldova and Ukraine to start the relationship. And in my work then, and this is such a kind of a fairy tale moment, because when I went out with basically an administrative officer who was going to help, figure out what we can rent, and can we, was the garage secure enough with the tin roof, and we had 2 doors, one to get in, one to get out. A diplomatic security officer and me, and that probably won't happen again, that they will let us travel that light to some of these places. So that was a different time, as you can imagine. So working with AID at that point, because I think AID also was going through huge challenges, massive money was coming in. The Congress was leaning heavily on this one, like, it's our chance to make them look like us. So it was like, democracy a go-go, and what can we do to go from a command economy to a market economy, to turn, the military factory up in northern, Belarus into, let's make optical lenses from their night vision goggles that they use during military time. So it was a heady time, and it was sort of my exposure, kind of the whole of government response, because there was not one agency, I don't think, in Washington that had an international arm that was not engaged in that effort. So then fast forward a little bit more, and this comes now probably into the more relevant conversation for many of you in this room now. I was overseas. I was in Japan when 9/11, 2001 took place. I came back a year later, and that's when I started working for Secretary Powell. And I know many of you were in government then at that time. We've got an old colleague here who was certainly working those issues. It became more and more old in the sense of familiar and good friends old, not anything chronological here. But again, and many of you might even be like students of what happened over the last 15 years, because gosh knows, there's books and books and movies and all sorts of, case studies on sort of what took place in that civ mil world that was the early 2000s, as the U.S. government went into Afghanistan, went into Iraq. And we knew that there was going to be huge development needs, there were going to be huge humanitarian needs. But again, were we all in that same conversation at the same time? So you learn those lessons from that, right? We learned those lessons from that. And I think from that, sprang a whole conversation and a whole different vocabulary that probably a lot of you are immensely comfortable with. But at the time then, it was like civ mil operations, stabilization, reconstruction, post-conflict, fragility, resilience. All these kind of new vocabulary started emerging in both the humanitarian and development world, which now fall off your tongue easily, but I think 10 years ago, it was still a bit of a struggle. The whole idea of soft power, the 3Ds, this is all things that people take for granted now, but it certainly wasn't taken for granted back then. I think, because of the intervention, certainly in Iraq and Afghanistan, that's when I decided, okay, I can't be, the classic foreign service officer that's working on economic governance, because that had been sort of my area. So at the request of the secretary, to help stand up an office which has gone through certain identity crises now, but I think it still exists as the Conflict and Stability Ops Bureau. But at the time, it was a Post-Conflict Reconstruction and Stabilization Office. Big title, bigger mandate, I think it was important to have it at the time. I think it's still important to have it. But what it meant to do was to help whole of government response, to help map conflict drivers in a situation and to bring the best, both strategic thinking and the best use of resources to it. That became a little bit of my narrative after that. Went then to the Foreign Assistance Office that was stood up by Secretary Rice, again trying to challenge primarily State Department and USAID, their foreign assistance budgets. Put DOD aside, because DOD just can collapse everybody in the room when it lands on your shoulders. But put state and AID together in a room, and I had the unenviable group of countries. I used to call them the Dirty Dozen. They were the 12 conflict countries that basically own 70% of our foreign assistance budget. So it was everything from the Iraq and Afghanistan to Sudan to Kosovo to Haiti. It was all of those. And we were basically challenged by the Foreign Assistance Office to bring together state and AID, all sorts of the bureaus that many of you may have worked with, to come in the room. And what was the saying then, Bill? Do you remember this? It was like you were to take off your uniforms. You were not there to be the democracy officer. You were not there to be the law enforcement and police training officer. You were there because you were a strategic thinker, and you were going to look at the problems of Haiti or Sudan or Congo, and just think what made the most strategic sense, what were the resources that were needed, and then at the very end of that conversation, you might then say, and it's going to go to AID, Democracy Office, you'll get that type of funding. But it falls on kind of bureaucratic territoriality. I get a knowing look from one of our colleagues in this room right now, because we would have these conversations, and people would start really, yes, strategic. We're going to think what's the best thing. We're not going to worry about my bureau, my job. But then I would have somebody go, but Marcia, at the end of the day, my metric is I got to walk out of this room with $30 million of democracy money. And I'm like, that's not too strategic. You're just telling me the number you needed. So I then thought, okay, working for State Department, I was provided the great opportunity to actually work for AID. They call them a crossover assignment. I went out to Macedonia. I was based in Skopje, but also was covering Kosovo from there. So that was my 2 years working for AID as a State Department. They actually let me come in and learn the handshake. Yeah, I know. Look what you've done, created a monster now. But I wanted to understand, okay, it's easy for me to sit in Washington and say, you be strategic and you be strategic, but I needed to be on the receiving end of somebody from Washington telling me, you've got $20 million, I need you to be strategic in Macedonia and Kosovo and economic growth. Start now. So I thought I needed to understand that how to spend the money smart, how to design the whole cycle of project design and implementation and evaluation. I was then asked to come back to Washington. This was my last foray in the Foreign Service. Come back to Washington and work at the Foreign Service Institute. And if you remember this was 2009 to 2010, and it was the big civilian surge to Afghanistan especially. We were trying very hard to bring expertise to the provincial reconstruction teams, both in Afghanistan and Iraq. Maybe there's somebody here who was actually on one and can describe that experience. But I was responsible for overseeing the training for that. And again, it's a question of readiness and preparedness for our government today, for the U.S. government today. The fact that we had to go and broker at least 3 weeks of training for somebody going out to Kandahar or going out to Najaf. I mean, the fact that, and I would tell our military colleagues, okay, I got 3 weeks to work with these civilians, and the military's like, 3 weeks, what are you giving us when they get there? But that's all we could afford. The civilian side of the U.S. government is always pressed, and it's always hard to respond fast. So 3 weeks was actually the most we could do. Again, it was a great opportunity to work with the military partners and to work with a lot of different organizations who would be meeting these PRTs out in the field. And that's certainly where I was working very closely with the ICRC at the time, non-governmental organizations that were also trying to deliver out in Afghanistan and Iraq. And then I went to U.S. Institute of Peace and got involved in the conflict prevention world. Then I went back to USAID. So before joining ICRC, just a year ago, I was at USAID, Democracy, Conflict, and Humanitarian Assistance Bureau, in a new position as crisis coordinator. So I have wrinkles and white hair to show for that. But again, it was an effort to work in a bureau, which one colleague here especially, I'm going to call him out, I'm going to have him tell a story about it later, But the DACHA Bureau, as many of you may know, it must have over $3 billion of assistance to work with, but mainly humanitarian, but also works in conflict prevention. And so when there was a crisis, is it closer to $5 billion? They better be spending it smart. But when there's a crisis brewing, maybe you can get ahead of the curve. You know elections are happening in Nigeria. You know there's going to be elections in Burma. What does this bureau do? Sometimes it's, oh goodness, Ebola just is coming into our borders. What do we do? But recognizing that a bureau with over 5 billion and 800 people and 9 different offices will all run at the crisis at a different speed, tempo, and resources and technical expertise. How do you get even a bureau at AID to speak with one voice? So I was brought in to help on that for 2 years. The day I walked in to AID in 2013, December, was the day they started shooting at each other in Juba. So guess what I did for about a year and a half at AID? So South Sudan, Nigeria, Ukraine, Burma, Central African Republic were some of the working groups that I was helping manage. Long walk through the history of Marcia Wong. I'm sorry I didn't have cookies or pictures, but I'm going to stop there and let's take questions and let that be guide our conversation.
Well, wow.
And I'm a Redskins fan.
If you were around in this time, and there's a few of us here who were through that, you just had a short course on U.S. foreign policy that's really impressive. So rather than, I usually start with a question or two, but I just wanted to make that comment. And now if you have questions, please raise them, because she just came up with so many issues that it boggles the mind. So let's start on this side, and we'll work around. And please, as you state your question, and question mark, it really is a question, not a statement, please, because we're here to hear her, not you. State your name and where you come from.
Hi, my name is Charlie Gilman. I'm a AAAS fellow at USAID. I have been here for 1.5 months. Before this, I was a scientist in Kazakhstan. Please explain what people actually do in these offices, because all I do is like arrange meetings, and they're paying an absurd amount of money for me to arrange meetings. But the point is, I want to go into CSO. Do I want to go into CSO at aid, or do I want to go in CSO at state? It's totally opaque to people from the outside. Maybe you can't relate to this, but how does anybody get a job in these places except they're going through the Peace Corps or through fellowships? Peace Corps and fellowships, all I found out. So like I'm in an office now, how do I get into a different office? So how do I get into a different office, and how do I know what they actually do? Like really do, not like the main idea.
Is this off the record? No, I don't.
No, it's a secret.
I don't want it to be a secret anymore.
Actually, should we take one or two at the time, or like my attention span?
Go ahead with this one.
Okay, let's go ahead with that one, because that's a fun one. Okay, let me do a little soft survey moment. Okay, how many of us in this room have had the pleasure of working on, what's the website, USAJobs.gov? Aha, you all knew it. Put your hands up, put your hands up. And you know how crazy frustrating that must be. Yeah, all the template driven and this and that. Yes, but it is, of course, one way to go in. It's wonderful, and thank you, actually, first of all. But coming with a science background is huge. Huge to USAID, certainly huge to State Department. May I ask what field of science?
My PhD is in molecular physiology and biophysics.
Well, of course, that's a no-brainer. You should be working in conflict and stabilization.
I'm doing human rights now, so.
Oh, whatever. Okay, but bravo. Because but there's a interesting point here, because it makes me very sad that there was one time, that shows you just, gee, how forward-looking is our government. When I was at State Department, there are things called cones for those who've gone through the whole system. I was economic cone, but I was still able to do a lot of different types of jobs, obviously, in that zigzag that I was doing up the field. But there was at one point a science and technology cone. And then somewhere along the way, in the mid or late 1990s, he said, "Oh, we don't need a science and technology cone. That's somebody else's agenda." And then when you look back on it now we are recruiting science, people who know climate change, who understand food security, who know water. So the intent to bring in people through channels like you just described, AAAS. To get specifically to your question, for those who may not know, CSO it's retitled Post-Conflict Reconstruction Office. It's the Conflict and Stability Ops Office. It is one bureau at State Department. It has, and I was certainly, maybe that's the next speaker will be somebody from that office. It is going through certain types of, it's going through an evolution of what skills it will bring to the larger State Department and then to the larger, quote, interagency process. When I was there, it had a huge mandate to do everything all the time with everybody. But we were given as an operating budget our first year, $5 million. And, you know, again, the wags over at DoD would say, Marcia, you're missing about 8 zeros behind that. I'm like, I know. So we were lucky at the time to get detailees from USAID, detailees from Department of Justice. I mean, it was meant to be whole of government, so let's have a whole of government presence. To get into CSO now, first of all, you do want to know what it does. And you do want to know what you can bring to it. Because there's probably nothing more probably frustrating, and maybe I'm only just articulating my own sense of like, I know a lot, but why is nobody recognizing that? So you may be challenged on, I am a molecular biologist, where do I best bring it? And CSO may not be the best place because, you know, if you're working in molecular biology, maybe then you want to work in the food security office or the water resource.
I do data science. I do data science.
Ooh, okay. So you're doing, okay, we're going to go down deep into your CV right now. But look into, okay, yeah, I mean, you're going to get a lot of gratuitous career advice from Marcia, so, you know, and maybe it's best over beers. But everyone, and I think I can ask some of my colleagues here to add to the story, the issue of data, aggregation, analysis. Everyone knows it's sexy. Everyone knows they're supposed to do it. But we're still struggling with the how. Even ICRC is like, oh my God, you know, impact on beneficiaries. I know I gave out 10,000 sanitation and hygiene kits, but are they actually being used? Did it make a change in anyone's life? Is it, you know, is anybody coming in the local government to make it durable? So if you're in the world of data analytics, Mr. Popular, I mean, but how do you impress that on a place like State Department? Okay, I'm sorry, I'm writing out my old you know, home, but understanding data, I mean, you had millions of different, basically, programming systems, metrics and evaluation and monitoring, all of that was sort of like, we're just going to put the money through the programs and get it out the door, and we have to go up to the hill to defend it, we will, but it didn't have the rigor. It didn't have the rigor. So CSO is trying to bring some of that rigor, both in the planning, but also in the evaluation side. So that might be playing to your strengths, if you understand data. So if you want, we can have an offline conversation about that. Okay, and I don't know what office you're working in AID right now where you don't know what your job is, but we'll talk about that too.
And I'll just add a couple of points. On the State Department side, with the data thing, HIU, the Humanitarian Information Unit, which is a whole of government thing, sort of. It's based in the State Department. It's usually headed, at least when we set it up, by an AID person, and it's got folks seconded from all other government agencies, and it works in classified and unclassified systems. I would also, at the State Department, look at the INR. These guys do a lot more on data. It's sort of the think tank intelligence folks within the State Department who do a lot of research. The Bureau for Food Security would also be, in AID, an important place to look, and I would also look at the Development Innovation Lab at AID, which is part of the Policy and Learning outfit that Wade Warren runs there. So there are a whole bunch of options for your expertise in various parts of aid and state. There were more hands. Okay, right here.
Hello, my name is Cheto Özer. I'm an independent researcher. So when we talk about human rights and humanitarian issues, we always see that there is a double standard. We talk about Afghanistan, we talk about Iraq, we talk about Syria, but we don't talk about our allies. The atrocities happening in countries that are allies. In Turkey, just 6 months ago, 10 towns were just flattened, and about 200,000 people were internally displaced. And according to the government's official figures, about 3,000 people, most of them civilians, were killed. But Amnesty International talk about it, human rights institutions talk about it, but the mass media in the US doesn't talk about it. And we actually prefer not to see it. So our silence, our inaction, how does it affect our allies' position, their humanitarian issues? Would that be different if we are more frank and we are open-minded and critical of these issues or not? Thank you.
Thank you. I think you put your finger on something that is a little bit of a kind of the bread and butter of the ICRC in many ways, and without giving away any big secrets here. The reason why I think an organization like ICRC is able to work in some of the places it does is that it very much weighs on the acceptance it has. Being neutral, being impartial, and being independent, we talk to everyone. And actually, this is something that, because of the standing that we have in international humanitarian law and the Geneva Conventions, we're granted certain privileges and immunities. And so that we are able to talk to the Taliban when you were not supposed to talk to the Taliban. We are, making our best efforts to stay engaged in a conversation with Boko Haram or different, elements of Al-Qaeda. Because acceptance is what allows us to get access. And we hope that acceptance also means that you can start having those frank and confidential conversations about how you treat your civilian population and how you may not be achieving whatever objectives you may have in front of you by being flagrantly disregarding of the rights of an individual and the rights and to dignity and to life. When you talk about partners, I think you're referring to state actors. Perhaps you're referring to those who are recognized as national authorities in country who may be turning a blind eye to things that are happening in a military conflict, if that's my understanding of your conversation, of your question. Again, without giving away any sort of big secrets, the ICRC certainly does engage in very frank and candid conversations when we can with the state authority. We don't go fast to the denunciation stage because that is going public. And when you see the ICRC go public, it's because every other step we had tried every other step along the way to talk to them about humanitarian law, the need to protect civilians, to the importance within humanitarian law of distinction, the difference between a military target and a civilian target, the importance of proportionality. Why blow up this bridge if it's going to be, when you're just responding to some guy, lobbing a rock at you? So proportionality is part of the conversation that we have around the world. And also just about, the military, there's a term of art that I'm missing out on here, but it's sort of the military objective. Is it really worth the effort? If you can bomb a bridge and it's going to be rebuilt in a day, but you're going to cause such damage, then why are you bombing this bridge? So if you see the ICRC go public, take it to the media that X country is not adhering to international humanitarian law, is in violation of XYZ of Geneva Conventions, every step along the way had been attempted for us. But we pride ourselves in the fact that we push hard to have this frank, confidential dialogues. I've been on the other side, maybe Bill has too, from his experiences overseas, where I know the U.S. government reaches into ICRC because we do have that confidential nature to say, what are they thinking? What are they really saying? And we can't really share that because it just breaks the whole nature of confidentiality for us. I think there are a lot of closed-door conversations that take place between strategic partners. Sometimes it's quite out there in the open. If you take a look at how some of the conversations have been going on right now in the UN Security Council on Syria. But the question is, when does it create real behavior change? And I think that's what you're getting at. Like, where's the pressure points to create real behavior change with some of our strategic allies? And those are probably higher order diplomatic questions that I can answer for you today.
Good afternoon. My name is Fatima Salman. I'm a student at Georgetown, getting my master's in foreign service. And I have a question with your zigzag analogy. I'm somebody that's coming from a world of education, and I'm trying to make a pivot into more global politics and security. And I'm just wondering, what advice do you have for somebody that's making a pivot in their career, specifically somebody that's more interested? For me, for example, I'm interested in South Asia, but I've been told many times to kind of stay away from Pakistan and get more into India. And so I'm just wondering, like, what I'm getting like mixed messages. And I've also been told to pick a functionality versus a region. And so what kind of balance is necessary? And also, like, how do you make that pivot then into showing that your interest is in specifically this region? And yeah, what is your advice for somebody like that?
I think when you're trying to break into another area, you have to kind of play to your obvious strengths. So, for instance, you have the language, you exploit the hell out of the language. Because you may be head and shoulders over others who might have all sorts of great expertise but won't necessarily have that language facility. I think when you're being challenged by people, geographic versus functionality, you do really need to consider that. When I think of some friends who in the Foreign Service, I studied Russian and I studied Japanese. I wish I had studied Arabic, and I wish I had studied Chinese. Like, where were my parents? When I was at home, why were they not speaking more Chinese to me, mom and dad? But to my kids now, and I do have to give a shout out to the people in La Plata, Maryland, University of Maryland Honors. If you're going to, think about the geographic, think about the investment you're going to be making in both the language and the culture, and then a lot of time perhaps overseas in that culture and in that geographic area. So you have to kind of ask yourself, good for me now at this point in my time, good for me 10 years from now, good for me 10 years from now with a family? I know this sounds a little bit cliche-ish perhaps, but at some point when someone said to me, I really, really, really need you to stay longer in Iraq than 3 months at a time, and I said, but I've got kids that I want to make sure they're not smoking pot and running guns in Mexico, I need to be home for this. So you do have to kind of put some of your own personal of that. And I know many people are in that, professional launch pad moment when you don't want to think about those things right now. But I would ask you to, because then you might find yourself with 2 years of, friends of mine in the Foreign Service, 2 years of Arabic under the belt, that, and there's a certain point in their career was made a lot of sense, but then it's like, but there's no schools for the kids, my wife can't work, or my husband, so it's sort of project a little bit into the future to say, is that something I want to do? So geographic can be both a blessing and a curse. It may single you out as being the person who knows that dialect in that province, in Northern Jalal, whatever. But it also may pigeonhole you. And so you have to think about the trade-offs of being the deep specialist, but then is that my career path for the next 20 years? So functionality, I'm kind of a believer that there is some room for specialization. Because again, there's a whole generation out there, as we all know, because I think you're all in this room right now, who your careers, your education is being shaped by the backdrop of the world we're living in now. So the Masters in Conflict Resolution, all these programs now, if you can find that molecular biology niche and make it be relevant to conflict prevention, doctor. So I actually would say go a little deep in some area. If you want to do education, then go education. And this might sound a little bit harsh, but think also where the resources are going. People don't argue against education. People don't, on the Hill, people don't argue about global health right now. So think about, democracy is hard. Democracy funding is hard. So for those who are looking at sort of, onward with the fight for, transparent and open media and free press, that's hard because the measurement's hard. So specialization is not anything to shy from if it is really what you want to go into and fashion that. But when you say if you're making a pivot from one area to another, then this is again just based on my own experience. So Bill, please chime in. Be willing to kind of throw your hand up in the air. Maybe you do have to arrange meetings for the first 6 months, but it gets you in. Gets you in. The other thing I want to say, because I know we've talked a little bit about US, .gov and all that. Development's taking place in a lot of different places, and many of you may be working in those areas. Private sector recognizes there is philanthropy in the private sector. I think they both recognize they bring intellectual capital, and ICRC, for instance, which is this sort of very kind of special little universe for a long time, recognizes, you know what? There is a huge construction company out there that's the leaders in repurposing rubble. And guess what Aleppo is right now? Rubble. We're going to work with that construction company to understand how to repurpose rubble, so we're not bringing in other new resources to create concrete. So, we're working with pharmaceuticals to bring in, insulin shots into Yemen. So the partnership's big. So you can work development from the private sector point of view too, certainly from the foundations. So there's lots of different ways to get into development than just .gov, if that helps.
Yeah, if I can just add, just before coming here, I was at the swearing in of the new U.S. ambassador to Nigeria, and I was at a lunch sitting next to a guy from ExxonMobil. And they have a massive development program all over the world, and they see that as a critical part of their activity. It's interesting to me, I was on both state and aid side, and you may disagree with this, but I think the long planning cycle for the State Department is about 6 months.
Oh, generous.
Yeah. AID, they claim 5 years, but it's actually 1 year because it's related to the budget cycle. The private sector is 75 years. And the first 10 or 12 years are planning how to engage in a country and be prepared for all sorts of pros and cons and things that happen, running their program and then getting out in the last decade or so. And when you talk to these folks, they have the same objectives as AID. They want a healthy, educated workforce who's going to buy their products in the future. So they want a prosperous economy. Now, they have a little different motive than AID does, but the objectives are the same in the short and medium term. So an area that is growing dramatically is huge private sector companies. That ExxonMobil happens to be oil, and Chevron I know well, is very much engaged in this. But other private sector companies have their own development departments. They have monitoring and evaluation programs. They have everything, maybe on a little smaller scale, that USAID has. So it's a big, big opportunity for folks to think about too.
Hi there, my name is Justin Archangel. I'm an undergrad student at GW. So I was basically, this is probably a question that you've heard a million times, but I'm wondering, from point of view in working with USAID state, is it better to go, right now in this climate, to go into the private sector, into NGOs to get a skill set, and then apply that to work in the federal government, or would it be better to kind of work through the channels within government kind of while I'm just out of school? And then the other thing that I was wondering is there any room for an undergrad education in state or USAID? Or do you need that master's, or do you need some kind of applicable skill set?
I think it probably, is it fair for me, actually, let me put the question first to you, because I've heard this mentioned to me in the past, that of a certain generation right now, the idea of having, over a course of 10 or 15 years, having 5 or 6 jobs is almost expected. That you'll happily move from 2 to 3 years here and there, you learn, you zigzag. I certainly came into the government when it was sort of, you come in and you're going to do 20 years and you're going to leave with a pension and a watch, and and you're going to be stable, and then and a watch. I get a watch. But it's, yeah, that's right. I can do bigger numbers. But that might be just something that's just that's something that maybe you would find that linear, path not at all of interest to you. The reason I, especially enjoy the Foreign Service, and maybe it's a reflection of my own attention span, is that every 2 or 3 years, I was challenged to what is your next job? What are you going to learn next? What are you going to contribute next? So you don't you don't stay in one place. It is a very competitive market, as I think all of you are really aware of. And so when you can look at, and even now, and I probably shouldn't tell you this, but I am going to tell you this, I am advertising for a job in ICRC right now for someone to help me on the World Bank relationship building. So let me know. it is so competitive out there that when I was at U.S. Institute of Peace, for instance, quasi-governmental, conflict prevention, conflict resolution, there were PhDs applying for jobs that were really asking for undergraduate level skill because the market was what it was. So again, do you have something that's really going to make you stand up just a little bit more? Like, will you have that 1 year in, Almaty, or a year in a province or state in India that gives your CV and gives your history a little texture and a little bit of flavor that may help you stand out. I think the experience that you can have in both a large NGO, because it'll have huge functions, would be valuable if you can get exposed to it. And that's a little bit of throw your hand up. If somebody says, I need a team to work on we're trying to create a concept note, a proposal for AID funding, and it's a contract, and we're gonna have to work 6 months and eat nothing but pizza, you put your hand up for those. Because you want that 6 month of pizza moment, because you're gonna learn a hell of a lot from that. I'm saying that word too much. So I do believe in throw your hand up and get engaged. And I know sometimes it's hard. It really is hard when you've got that graduate degree and you're like, I'm sitting here making table tents. But then again, you're in that room for a conversation that you might not have normally been in on. So I am a big believer in throw the hand up and step forward on some things. Small NGOs, and I, again, have not worked for a small NGO, but I'm working with small NGOs and others, especially if it's small, is that you will probably get multi-layer jobs, and your job description might be everything. But I think the one thing, and actually it would be good to hear from Bill's experience too and others in the room, they're also, and you have to be comfortable with this, there is a whole, and when I say development, I don't mean in the, we're gonna go out and do sustainable development programs. I'm talking about the fundraising and the resource side of development. If you're comfortable in that space, if you're comfortable with the grant writing, understanding contracts, the bidding process, if you understand foreign assistance and the budgeting process, then you will be valuable to every organization in this town that is trying to understand and get into that process. So there's two things I could kind of advise people when they're talking about working in Washington. Understand the Hill, because your organization is either advocacy, maybe even lobbying it. We're trying to influence it. Even ICRC, we don't lobby, but we go and we brief the Hill on what we just did in Lake Chad and what we're seeing and how we're trying to affect things. So the Hill, and understand, again, if you're in Washington in this very rarefied air, understanding the foreign assistance appropriation process, knowing what the counts are. I know this sounds very jargony, forgive me, but it's like, hello, I'm working on countering violent extremism, and I'm at USAID, and all this money just went over the State Department. How do I get some? And then you realize, oh wait, it's in this NADER account, which, what is the acronym for that? It's demining. AID can't really get that money because there are legislative prohibitions on security account money. You know that makes you that much smarter than somebody down the hall who's probably spending a lot of time trying to figure out how to get the money. No, the conversation is how to find some other avenue to get the money. So those are kind of two, if you guys are building where do I need to be smart, then if you can get some exposure to those two worlds, I think that'll make you valuable to that.
And I would add, just as a general, the way this town operates, it's all networking. And so talk to people. Come to things like this, meet people, and if anybody in this town points to their success and said, I did it on my own, they're lying to you. Excuse me. Everybody has been helped by somebody to move up through this town in their career. So everybody, you never ask anybody for a job. You ask them for advice. Everybody wants to give you advice. And that's the way you get around town. And no one's offended by you asking that, because they did exactly the same thing when they started in this town. So networking in Washington is just a very big part of finding out what you want to do. Because as Marcia said, the foreign assistance area is a very broad area, and there are aspects to it you may never have thought of. A while back, we did a session here on the famine early warning system, FUSE system, and people thought, that's foreign assistance. Yeah, big time, it is. And it gets a lot of aid funding, and it's known worldwide what the FUSE system is. But those are data folks and folks who work on agriculture and water and all sorts of things that doesn't normally roll off your tongue when you're thinking about development jobs. There are all sorts of different aspects to this broad area that are riddled throughout this town. And so the trick is talk to as many people as you can, ask for advice, and you'd be surprised what you find out.
I think it's actually, that's also something we should add. It's like, how important is it for you to be working in this town? Or working, getting as far as possible from this town. Because, yeah, the whole networking thing, and I will let you know, I'm the only Wong apparently in ICRC. I don't know how, with 15,000 employees and 80 operations, what? But anyway, mwong@icrc.org. If you want to ping me after this and ask me a specific question, I'm happy to do that. Because as Bill said, people look out for each other, and people have looked out for me all through my career. You may end up in one place, but because someone did a good job in taking you to that place and this place, that happens to maybe all of us. But if I have opened up mwong@icrc.org on this, I want you to open yourselves up to people too asking you for advice in the future and now.
Anybody have a last question or two? Because we're going to try and keep this to an hour, and we're at about an hour. We appreciate everybody's time, and everybody's busy. But a final, over here.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Marin Wolf. I'm a master's student at GW for Global Public Health, and my background is in emergency nursing, but I want to go into emergency preparedness, disaster response, humanitarian relief. And I know that there are a lot of different approaches to doing that, such as through the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance, something like the ICRC, and then also all the NGOs, Doctors Without Borders, Relief International, Save the Children, et cetera. I was wondering if you could talk about the different approaches that they take and benefits and maybe fallbacks of each.
Well, I'll comment. I'll give you a chance to think a little bit. Now I've retired from the U.S. government. I work for the International Medical Corps, which provides humanitarian assistance largely in conflict areas, and we work primarily in the Middle East and East Africa. And there are lots of opportunities, particularly for nurses. We were I think the largest responder to Ebola a year and a half ago in West Africa. And I think the opportunities are enormous. One area you forgot, which is, it sounds like you're interested in international stuff. Look at FEMA, and one of the interesting places to work with your skills, the Fairfax County Fire and Rescue, which do urban search and rescue for OFDA. And these guys are all over the world all the time, advising different parts of different governments. We work with, I was in OFDA for about 13 years or so, a while back. And it's Fairfax County Urban Search and Rescue, and LA County are the two that the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance works with. And when I grew up a long time ago, fire departments were volunteer. Now, all these folks have master's degrees, and most of them speak several languages. And so you can go almost any place in the world, and Fairfax County or LA County will have several people who speak the local language. That's an area that's very interesting too, and they're very involved in international affairs, and international disasters. So that the private sector, local government, OFDA, the State Department, ICRC, NGOs, a lot of NGOs. There are a lot of opportunities for your particular skills, and just, again, snoop around. If you look at our website, we're probably advertising for 50 people right now with assorted skills. And I guess the one thing I wanted to add is a lot of times the skills that are really important, at least the NGOs, are management and logistics. If you know how to run an office and make the supplies work on time, epidemiologists are a dime a dozen, frankly. You can find them all over the place, but someone who can run an office and manage people and run a logistics system, man, they're golden. So business degrees and that sort of thing are really important adjuncts to maybe you never think about taking a few accounting or business courses, but they come in real handy.
To follow up on that, look at UNICEF. You're doing a lot of work in nutrition right now, which is right up your alley. And a great guy that I like to talk to about this is Peter Morris, who's a great guy at USAID. And he's
the head health guy in office.
He is
OFDA. Because we had Peter here.
He knows what he's talking about.
We can hook you up with Peter if you want to chat with him.
I think from ICRC, there is a whole health sector, working on, everything from the communicable, non-communicable diseases. So please, if you are interested in working for an organization like ICRC, go on the website. They are advertising for people with those medical and technical skills. I think the one thing, again, recognizing the organization like ICRC is it'll be delegation offices in the capitals and a lot of what we call sub-delegations who are going to be outside the capital. And kind of in tough situations at times. And unlike, I think, some of the NGOs and certainly our OFTA and Food for Peace and other colleagues, it attempts, it has a very light security footprint, and you have to be comfortable with that. As one person explained to me how, we can't, you don't travel with armed escorts. You have the emblem, you have the Red Cross, and it's not meant to be a Christian emblem. It is just, the Red Cross. That is your protection. You're not wearing the body armor, and you're not wearing, So that's something you have to be comfortable with. Working in sometimes tight and sometimes hard conditions, but recognizing it's the acceptance that allows you to work there. I think another place, just in terms of your own technical skills, and I know my colleagues in OFTA who work on health would be kicking me right now, but I'm going to say it, CDC. Yep. They were there's always a little bit of good healthy competition with CDC and some of the other health providers, but I would certainly take a look at them also, and actually even Health and Human Services. The one thing also I just want to mention, because we keep on talking about .gov, and Bill and Mike, who ran USAID DACA when I was over at State SCRS, the reliance on contractors. The reliance on contracting, the big contractors, it is, whether we like it or not, it is a way of life. For some of our agencies to be able to pull expertise in and move it out, they go through contractors. Some of them are long-term. Our colleagues in Office of Transition Initiatives, Personal Services Contract, they're there, and that's the way they are employed. And so again, it does not have that 20-year stability, you're going to get a watch at the end of it dynamic. But maybe you're comfortable with that, and that's okay, and it's a renewable every year. So again, it's your own comfort level, but I would not shy away from that, because that might, again, be the way to get your foot in the door, the way for you to map an organization, and a way for you to put your hand up when you need to.
I'll just make a final comment on that, having spent time in AID and State Departments. You have foreign service positions, you have civil service positions, you have AAAS fellows, and personal services contractors is a very big thing. Now, the problem is you're treated as the same as a diplomat. You operate under diplomatic passports and these sort of things, but you don't get the health benefits and these sort of things. So a lot of people early on in their career do it for a few years, because that's not as big a thing until you have a family or you get a little older. Or folks like me, after you retire from the government, you go back to it, because I've got foreign service health insurance, which is great, and all this sort of stuff. I don't need that stuff. But it's a good way, as Marcia said. I think it's fair to say, if you look for the jobs that are advertised by U.S. government agencies, 3/4 of them, they know exactly who they're going to hire, but they have to go through the process. And they really pretty much know. A good number of those people may very well be personal services contractors that they have experience working with. And so they've crafted a job description, so this person, yeah, you're nodding your head. So this person fits exactly. So there is an advantage early in the career if you want to work for Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance, OTI, CSO in state. A lot of these hire personal services contracts. And when I was in AID, you'd be hired for a year, once or twice, and then they'll do it for 5 years. And so it's a way into the system to keep in mind. It may not be the ideal, because you don't have the benefits and all that comes with the government position, but it gives you a leg up over. And the other thing that happens when you get hired, which you got to think about if you want to work for the United States government, is you get a security clearance. And that takes time. And if you have a security clearance and there's 100 people applying for the same job and you're the only one with a security clearance, you're going to get the job, because otherwise it takes a year. So a security clearance is really golden when you want to work for a foreign affairs agency, and that's state and aid, defense, and the intelligence agencies. And so if you can get in as a PSC, then they get your security clearance. That will serve you well all sorts of different ways.